Today, we're going to talk about one of the tools in our strategy analytics toolbox, how you estimate whether a company has a relative willingness to pay advantage compared to its competitors. So why does this matter? Strategy is about how firms create economic value, how they capture economic value, and how they sustain it over time. And there are really only two ways you can create economic value. One is by cutting costs, but the other, very important, is by raising target customers' willingness to pay for your good or service, or of course you can do both of those. So willingness to pay is a crucial component of value creation. The problem with willingness to pay is it's hard to estimate, right? Like costs we can observe, they're reported costs. Price we can typically observe, but willingness to pay we almost never directly observe. So how can we tell whether a company has indeed created a willingness to pay advantage? So let's think about this a little bit. The obvious place to start is with price, right? So we can observe price, and it does give us very important information about willingness to pay. But price in and of itself doesn't tell us much. So it's priced at $5 or $5,000 or $5 million, depends on what the product is. So you need to have some benchmark to compare price to. So let's take the industry average for comparable goods or services as one benchmark that we could use. Not the only one, but one we could use. And then once you've done that, then you can say, okay, we've got a price. Let's take as the example airlines and flights from Boston to London. And we say we've got an industry average price for those flights. And then we can look at a company's price relative to the industry average for comparable goods or services. So you could have a company like British Airways, BA for instance, that charges a premium over the industry average. Great, that's observable. And at the other extreme, you could see a company that charges a discount. They have lower prices than the industry as a whole. Let's say Ryanair, for instance. Okay, you might say, fine, now we know if a company charges a premium, it must have willingness to pay. If it has to discount, it must have lower willingness. It has a willingness to pay advantage. If it has to discount, it must have a lower willingness to pay or willingness to pay disadvantage. It's not quite that simple, right? You have to take into account not only price, but at minimum also change in market share over time. So let's think about that other dimension. So we'll talk about market share over time. And let's say that our benchmark here is that a company maintains market share. So it had market share of 25% last year. It has market share of 25% again this year. And again, we could imagine market share changing, right? So a company could gain market share. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, BA is every year luring more and more passengers to its flights, or conversely, relative to its historical market share, a company could be losing market share. Great. So now let's just kind of think through the interaction between pricing and market share and what they tell us about willingness to pay or relative willingness to pay. So we're going to treat this as if these two dimensions are binary. So your change in market share, you're either gaining or losing, and your industry average price, you're either pricing above that or pricing below that. Of course, these are both continuous variables. This is just simplified for the sake of exposition. But let's just imagine a very simple world where you can either gain or lose market share, and you can either charge a premium or a discount relative to industry average pricing. Great. So let's start at the upper right quadrant. Okay, so let's imagine you've got a company, let's say it's British Airways, and they're charging a premium. So they charge well above the industry average price, and they're still gaining market share. Okay, in that case, it's safe to infer that they probably have a willingness to pay advantage, right? Because despite the fact they charge more than their competitors, customers are still they're still gaining customers relative to the industry as a whole. Okay. Let's take the opposite diagonal. So let's imagine a company, let's say it's Ryanair enters this route, and they have steep discounts. And despite that, they keep discounting, and they still keep losing share. Okay, so people say, look, I don't want to spend 7 hours standing up on my flight just to save $50. I'm going to fly with British Airways. So in a situation like that, where a company is charging less than the industry average and still managing to lose market share, very strong evidence that they have a willingness to pay disadvantage relative to competitors. Now let's think about the off diagonals. Let's take this one. So here we have a company, let's say it's Emirates Airlines, and they're pricing below the industry average, but they're gaining market share. Does that mean that they have a willingness to pay advantage? Not clear, right? It could be that their willingness to pay is exactly, the customer's willingness to pay for their flights is exactly the same as the industry average. Emirates is the only company, or only airline that drops their prices, and so they gain share. Well, all that really tells us is that consumers would prefer, all of the things being equal, to pay less for a comparable good or service, right? So we don't really know if a company has willingness to pay advantage or disadvantage if they're discounting and gaining market share. And conversely, in this quadrant, if a company charges a premium, so there's an airline who raises their pricing to $1 million a seat, well, they must have a willingness to pay advantage. Not necessarily. Not if nobody buys the seats, right? So if they raise their prices to $1 million per seat and lose all of their traffic, then it's not at all clear that there's a willingness to pay advantage. So this is, again, in this quadrant, we really don't know whether a company has a willingness to pay advantage or not. So the punchline here is, when you're thinking about willingness to pay, we don't observe it directly. Price provides an important clue to what's happening with willingness to pay, but you have to consider it at minimum. In addition to price, you have to consider what's happening with the company's market share. There are other ways to estimate willingness to pay. For instance, you can run experiments. So if you're selling products or services online, you can experiment with prices and see if customers still buy. You can run auctions, which are a very good mechanism to discover, to help prices to approach willingness to pay. If you have a monopolist providing a good or service, that may give you some clue as to what willingness to pay for that good or service is. So, take the example of broadband provision, right? So if you're a Comcast customer, you will know for a fact that whatever the price is, it is very close to willingness to pay. And why do they charge that? Because they're a local monopolist, and they can. There are formal tools to estimate willingness to pay, even if you can't observe it. Conjoint analysis being one example. Catherine Tucker teaches a course here at Sloan on pricing, which, by the way, you should all take, and you can learn those tools in that course. And finally, there are some situations where, say, you have an industrial customer who pays a certain amount to get something done, and you can offer a product or a service that reduces the costs for them to get that task done. You can use those cost reductions to estimate what that industrial customer's willingness to pay for the good or service might be. So again, willingness to pay, crucial driver of value creation, one of two. Hard to measure directly, but there are some tools that allow you to estimate whether you have a willingness to pay advantage or not.